We'll call the Surgeon Water Board Pension Committee meeting to order. Special Counsel, you please call the roll.
Director Pashue,
Here.
Director Scholas,
Present.
Director Anthrop,
Here.
Director Kennedy,
Here.
Councilmember Freddie King, Ms. Shine,
Here.
Ms. Johnsey, Mr. McBool, Mr. Joseph.
Here.
Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Thank you. We have on the agenda 2 presentation items this morning and 2 action items. Both of those will be presented by Mitchell Bilby from Run Wisdom. So, Mitchell, with that, will you proceed with the first presentation?
Yes, sir. Good morning. Thank you all for having me here. I've got 2 presentations this morning. I want to give brief background on both. One is the actuarial experience study. That's something that is recommended to be done every 5 years. It's been 5 years since the last one. And so that's why I'm here today. The other is goes over some potential amendments requested to be discussed by a member of the Pension Committee. And the reason they're kind of both being presented today is when this came up a year or 2 ago, we advised that it would be better to wait until the experience study was complete, because basically the experience study becomes the baseline from which we price the amendments. So they're not really related, but it's good to do them together. So that's the background. As also mentioned, today we'll satisfy some ongoing education with respect to the pension plan. So as you sit through this, keep that in mind that you're getting credit. All right. So the first presentation is the actuarial experience study. It's fairly long. I'll try and get through it quickly so we can get everything done in an hour. We're going to talk about the assumptions, review them, review actuarial methods, and summarize what we recommend based on the experience study. So the purpose of an actuarial evaluation is to do a multi-decade projection into the future of future plan benefit payments. And the idea is that they're used to determine an appropriate level of funding for the pension plan. We're modeling the cost of the plan, but these are just models. They do not determine the ultimate cost of the plan. The ultimate cost of the plan is really the cumulative employer contributions, or thinking about it another way, it's the amount of benefits and expenses paid from the plan reduced by the investment earnings on prior contributions. And those costs are independent of the assumptions. They are based on what the actual experience is of the plan. And with respect to the assumptions we're talking about today, the responsibility for selecting the assumptions rests with the Board of Trustees, but obviously with advice, in this case, particularly from the actuary and sometimes the auditor and investment counsel. So this graphic here just kind of gives you an idea of how the actuarial assumptions are used. If we look on the left-hand side, we start at the valuation date, typically January 1 of each year. And we use all these probabilities of termination, withdrawing employee contributions, pre-retirement death, salary growth to project active employees into the future. When will they terminate? When will they retire? Once they reach a retirement date in the future, as shown in the middle of this, are they going to retire at an early retirement age, at normal retirement age at 65, or sometime after that? Will they elect a drop, or will they immediately go into retirement and collect an annuity? And what form of payment will they elect? A life annuity, a joint survivor option? And then after someone's retired, we project how long do they live with post-retirement mortality assumptions, and the benefits increase with COLAs, or cost of living adjustments each year. And then, as the bottom arrow shows, we take those projected benefit payments at each point in the future and we discount them back to the valuation date based on the expected investment return of the trust to say, here's the present value of the liability. So that's the general idea. Why do we do the experience study? Well, by having assumptions that best model the experience of the plan, it can reduce contribution and accounting volatility due to differences between actual experience and assumed experience. For the actuaries, we have to use reasonable assumptions required by our actuarial standards of practice, and in particular, this ASOP number 35, that we have to disclose the methods we use to select the assumptions and do a proper analysis in setting them. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends that experience studies be performed every 3 to 5 years. The last study we did was 5 years ago for the 5-year period ending 12/31/18, and this study was based on plan information through December 31, 2023. So, and ultimately what we're going to talk about today is comparing assumed rates or assumed assumptions relative to actual experience over that 5-year period.
Mitchell, experience study, just for me, I'm new to the board, is just based on the difference between the last time an experience study was done and this current one. What do we mean by experience study?
Sure. So for example, we make an assumption about how many people are going to terminate each year based on their age and service. But what we do over this 5-year period is we go back and look at who terminated, how old were they, how long was their service, and we compare that to our assumptions and go, were the assumptions on track, too low, too high? So the experience is the actual experience of the population in the plan.
Okay, but for budget to actual in mind, expected to actual.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So these are all the assumptions we're going to talk about today, some of them very briefly, some a little more at length. And we split them into 2 categories: demographic, that would be the mortality, termination, retirement, et cetera, and the economic, the general price inflation, the cost of living adjustment, and the big one, expected return on assets or the discount rate, as well as compensation increases. So for the mortality and mortality improvement assumption, this graphic here shows the current assumption in the left-hand side and the recommended, and in the red indicates recommended changes. And so for mortality, because the plan has 2,000 members roughly, it's not credible to use the actual mortality experience of the plan, the number of people that died. You need a much bigger population to do that. And so there are, the Society of Actuaries has a retirement plans experience committee that looks at public pension plans across the country. Most recently, this is their most recent study, resulting in the public plans, or PUBG for general employee population, was developed based on information through 2010. And we last experience study, we decided that was the best table to use, but we made some adjustments to it. The adjustment factors are based on the fact that mortality in Louisiana is higher than the national average. And so we used statistics from the CDC that looks at actual Louisiana mortality compared to the nation average, and determined that the mortality for males, for example, last experience study was 122% higher in Louisiana than the national average. And likewise, there's a factor for females. In addition, we project mortality improvement using a projection scale developed by the RPEC committee. And what we're doing there is saying, well, medical improvements, things like that, people are expected to live longer further in the future. So someone who's 21 years old today has a longer life expectancy than someone who was born 40 years ago and was 21 20 years ago. And so that's what that mortality improvement projection scale does. And again, using CDC statistics, we observed that the mortality improvement in Louisiana was slower than the nationwide average. And that's where that, in that left-hand side, the 86% for males, it's 86% of the improvement of the country on average, or 79% for females. And so this go around, 5 years later, there has not been a more recent mortality experience study than this PUB 2010 table. So we're not recommending any changes to that. But we looked at, again, mortality improvement for Louisiana versus the nation in the last 5 years, well, really over a longer period, but included the last 5 years, and made slight adjustments to these factors. So the male factor went down a little bit, and so mortality in Louisiana has improved a little bit relative to the nation for males, and you can see also that mortality improvement is a little better, that Louisiana may be catching up mortality improvement-wise with the rest of the country. So that's the idea here, this is a methodology that seems to be getting adopted by more and more pension plans as this sort of analysis.
So Mitchell, the COVID period fell in our 5-year last, from the last time. So was that considered in this study?
Well, yes and no. So we considered that it existed and we decided not to incorporate it. In fact, I kind of skipped over that. So that mortality projection scale, MP 2019, that's the year the scale was published, but it's based on data through the end of the prior calendar year. Or maybe it's a 2-year lag, I've forgotten. But it has been updated since then to MP 2021, so we are recommending that change, but the committee that does this study has not updated the table for the last 3 years because of COVID. And so they just published, they're not updating it for 2024, but they expect to start updating it again next year. And so I suspect the way they're going to do that is they're just going to take out that data and ignore it, but I don't know what they're going to do yet. And so one change is, and thank you for bringing this up, that before we're using MP 19, now we want to say, let's use MP 21 because that is the most recent one, again, prior to the effects of COVID. But if they update it to MP 25 next year, we want to use that for the subsequent valuations and not have to come back and have a meeting about should we adopt it. That it's the current, it will be the current standard, and so we think that should be used.
Thank you, Mitch.
I wanted to ask you, do you actually collect the data from our benefit department instead of generalizing the two datas? So, I mean, to come back to the ground reality, we should be extracting the data from our benefit department and comparing it to the national numbers, rather than having both at 50,000 feet high.
If we use the information for this assumption, for mortality, it's statistically, it's not credible.
I mean, but you're getting the actual data. It's
Yeah.
not like you're hypothetically calculating based on national averages.
He's using Louisiana, he's not using the United States.
No,
So
but
they
if
did
we
look-
have the data available for our department, why not
We
incorporate that?
do have the data, but it's not credible. You need at least 1,000 or 1,100 deaths over the big study period to have credible data, and you all have dozens of deaths over that period. And so to try and use that data to say we should set the assumption for everybody would create an assumption that wouldn't be very useful or valid. So that's the reason for mortality. For all the other assumptions, we're looking at the actual planned population. And incidentally, that is one of, in the lengthy mortality study about PUBG and all that, they talk about credibility and things like that. So we're following the recommendation. For the other demographic assumptions, we're going to use some terminology here about decrements. Those are the retirement, termination, people exiting the population for various reasons, disability. Exposures, that over the experience period, we will look at the number of people who could have retired, who are eligible to retire, are eligible to terminate vested, et cetera. So we're looking at actual people who meet those eligibility conditions for a given benefit. And we count the actual numbers who actually exited the population for the various causes. And then we compare them to what we expected by applying our assumption that we currently have to the number of exposures over that period. If there are more actual than expected for a given assumption, so if there's more actual retirements than expected, that means our assumption was too low. Hey, there's more that are happening. We probably need to increase that assumption. If the other happens, there are fewer retirements than we expected, well, that may mean that our assumption is too high and we should adjust the assumption the other direction. We don't just necessarily go, well, what happened during the 5-year period and let's mimic it. We look to smooth anomalies and we also look forward and say, well, should we expect the same thing going forward or not? But in general, we're targeting an actual to expected ratio close to 100%, with some exceptions, some of which have to do with COVID this go round. So we're being cautious with respect to that. We're going to go over a couple assumptions in detail to explain how this works. For the termination assumption, we determined last experience study, and we think it's still true, that during the first 5 years of employment, termination rates are much higher. They still vary by age and tend to be lower at older ages and higher at younger ages. But we observe that once you get past that 5-year period, things trend downward and terminations are at lower rates. So this graphic here shows the termination rates for those with less than 5 years accredited service over the last 5 years. And the black dashed line shows you the actual rates of termination. So we've looked at the number of exposures, people who are eligible to terminate, which is everybody, except for those eligible to retire. We take them out of this equation. And we count up the number of terminations and compare them to the number of people that could have terminated, and that's what the black dashed line means. So you can see that, yes, higher at younger ages, lower at higher ages, and it follows that pattern. The red line was what we've been assuming based on the prior experience study. So it's same pattern, smoother in the middle years and lower at the age 55 and above. And what we're recommending is this blue line. So the blue line you can see falls somewhere in between the black and the red. And the reason we're not getting closer to the black line with our recommended assumption is again because of COVID. So there were more across the nation, we saw more terminations than in other years during COVID. And so we don't want to give too much credibility to all of the terminations. So we don't want to overreact and make the termination assumption too high. So that's the idea there. Then on the more than 5 years of service, again, we see lower rates of termination in the prior graph. We were up at 25% and coming down to about 10% during these ages. Here, yes, we do have some at the early ages. It's still pretty high, but you can see we're well below 10% at ages 30 and above, and getting down to closer to 5% of people terminated at ages 50 and above. And so same sort of thing. The black line is the actual experience. The red line is what we had assumed. You can see the red line. We had more terminations than we expected. So we should increase our termination assumption, but we don't want to overreact and just follow the black line. And then where you can see the blue is north of the or above the black line. That's just smoothing and not trying to just follow the exact pattern. But in aggregate, when we take these two recommended assumptions, this graphic shows in the left-hand column the current assumptions, and the right-hand column the recommended assumptions. And so we have the actual number of terminations. Over the last 5 years, 646 people actually terminated prior to retirement eligibility. The expected number using the current assumptions was 592. So our actual to expected ratio, 646 divided by 592, is 109%. And we're going, well, we should be closer to 100%. And using the assumptions that were shown in that graph in the blue, it produces 626 expected terminations, still an actual to expected of 103%, indicating there were more terminations than we would be expected using the new assumption. But we're doing that intentionally to try and not overreact to COVID, as I said before. So that's the idea there. Any questions about that process?
Question about effect. So if we, just for clarity, if we end up with a projection of under 100%, right?
Yes.
Inverse.
Yes.
How does that impact us down the road? How does that impact the overall?
So if you have fewer terminations than expected over the long term and you don't adjust your assumptions, then what's happening is more people are reaching retirement eligibility. The cost of the plan is more than we're assuming. And when you get to paying out the benefits, we're short, exactly. And so that actually leads nicely into this hard to look at graphic. But this is the retirement rates. And they're both, we base these assumptions as shown in the full report, which is an information item in this, on both age and service. But an age and service graph doesn't lend itself nicely to, this is as nice as it can look. Otherwise, we'd be looking at a 3D graph that would be awfully confusing. But based on those age and service assumptions, so for example, when someone reaches the rule of 80, we expect a spike in retirement. Now they're eligible for full unreduced benefits. That's an age and service combination of 50 and 30 or 60 and 20, whatever it is. Whereas before that, we might expect lower retirements. So that's what I mean by age in service. But here, again, the black represents the actual retirements as a rate, actual number of retirements versus compared to the number of people that could have retired during the 5-year period. The red, you can see that's the current assumption. Again, it's in general higher than the black line at almost every age, not quite, but almost. And then the blue line is what we're recommending. So we think the retirement rates are too high. The other thing is we are seeing more retirements after age 70. So 5 years ago, we didn't really see anybody retiring after age 70, maybe one at age 71. So our assumption stopped at age 71. Now we're recognizing or recommending that the assumptions be extended to age 75. You're not going to have a lot of people in that range, but you may see that grow over time. And so those are the changes. And then putting this into numbers, again, the current rates on the left, recommended rates on the right. The actual number of retirements the last 5 years were 122. We expected 220. So to your point, there were 55% actual to expected ratio, so our assumption was too high. And we do want to reduce it and produce 163, again, a 75% actual to expected. And so why not 100? Well, again, there's COVID experience, and the nationwide observation was fewer people were retiring during that period. A lot of uncertainty, so people wanted that job security and didn't know what would happen. You know, their 401k balances were tanking, you know, things like that. I can't retire. And so fewer people were retiring. That said, we do think, you know, we should change the rates. And so that's what we're recommending. And if in 5 years, you know, experience shows something different, we would recommend another adjustment.
Can you go back to the previous slide, please?
Yes.
Why are you recommending that a whole lot of more people will be retiring after 70?
Well, it's really not. It looks like a whole lot more. That what we're saying is 1 in 5 are going to retire. If they're there at age 70 or above, 1 in 5 is going to retire. And so you might have, right now, I don't know what I could look it up, but you might have 10 people over age 70 in the workforce, you know. And so it's not like they're going to retire at some point. We're just saying it may not be right away, that they may be here a couple more years. So that's what's going on.
Historically, we don't have as many people retiring after 70.
Correct, but we've seen
Increase.
over the last, looking at 5-year period to 5-year period, we're seeing an increase.
And that's your assumption.
And that is our assumption. So yeah, we're recommending that we follow that people are working later. And again, that's something we're seeing nationwide too. As Social Security age, full retirement has been extended to 67. It used to be 65 and could get extended again. We don't know. So there's other factors that go into someone's decision to retire.
So Mitchell, on this slide,
Yes.
just try to put what Board Member Kennedy said into perspective. So the 55% versus the 74%.
Right.
So how does that affect the plan relative to the 74%? How does that?
So basically, we were assuming more retirements than actually happened. We're still going to recommend that, but what it really means is it's not that people are not retiring, they just haven't retired yet. And so what that indicates is people are retiring at later ages. And so when we're pricing the plan, there's 2 aspects. There are people continue to accrue benefits, so they may have a higher retirement benefit. So we need to anticipate that in pricing the liability. But at the same time, even though they accrue more benefits, they contribute more, and also their time in retirement is going to be shorter. That, you know.
Ooh.
So.
Sorry, I asked.
It's translated to dollars in a subsequent slide.
Yes. And so we do, at the end of this, I'm going to show you the effect of all these. But I'm sure you'll be in retirement longer. You know, it's not going to affect you, just other people. Yeah.
So that almost 20% jump Can you explain it a little more?
Well, yes, so what that means is that,
20% of the workforce is going to be retiring later, or what it is?
well, yes, the people will be retiring later than what we assumed. And in some cases, retiring earlier at certain age and service combinations, but in general, later on average. And that what we don't want to do, though, is assume that, hey, everyone's going to retire a lot later. The people that didn't retire during COVID may retire soon, but the younger workforce may retire later on average, just as people
Because,
work longer.
Since we have a cap, after so many years, you lock in at 100%.
Yes,
So it can never go over 100%.
correct.
So why is that not taken into account? Why would these people be, 20% of them will be,
Yeah,
unless they came in late and they want to stay late?
right. So there's people that come in, hired after age 40 or 45 that will not get the full 30 years or 34 years to get to 100%. But all that's taken into account in this assumption that or in the valuation, that we recognize that that certain age and service combinations are, so once you reach that 34 years, you're more likely to go out than not,
No, I understand, but my question is that these are averages based on actual number of hirees, or is some across the board universal?
So these are just based on the planned population,
Okay.
not anything else in the country. Yeah. And we'll get to, at the end, we'll get to the magnitude of all these changes and assumptions. The drop assumption, this is, when people retire, they can either enter the drop and continue to work during the drop period and have a pension contribution, or their pension payment contributed to a drop account, and that accumulates until they actually leave employment. And then they get that lump sum, as well as collect their monthly annuity going forward. Or they can just truly retire, stop working, and start collecting their pension payment immediately. And so what we see is, yes,
Again, as far as your actual number, people on drop, they capitalize on the entire drop period, or they drop out of that?
yeah. So
That's the actual number, if you can
Yeah, so-
elaborate a little more.
So the drop period can be up to 5 years long. A member elects what their drop period is at retirement. However, they can retire earlier if they choose.
So what is that percentage?
And so I don't have that number in here. I believe the average drop period is over 4 years. It's between 4 and 5. So we do assume, for purposes of the valuation, that people use the full 5-year drop, but the reality is some
Take
are
the
gonna-
worst case scenario.
And so what we observed is that folks under age 60 will take the drop at a higher rate than folks over age 65. And looking at the actual number of drops in the left compared to the total retirements in the middle, we have these drop percentages of 34 out of 42 retirements during the 5-year period were drop elections, or 81%, and so on. And you can see the declining percentage based on age in that graphic. So that is, as you can see, our current assumption was 90% for under age 60, 60% for 60 to 65, and 30% above. And so we're making adjustments downward on the first rate and upward on the other two, and just kind of smoothing the results around.
And then again, these red are based on the actual numbers.
Actual experience of the plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we only had 122 retirements in 5 years?
Yes, and I think, again, COVID reduced
Did
that.
that.
And I think the anecdotal evidence is year-to-date in '24, you've seen more retirements maybe than on average, so it seems like it's kind of
Catching up.
picking back up, which again argues for,
It always come in a wave.
right.
So does this show how many are eligible to elect for retirement? Like, how does that, where does
Yes,
that?
so well,
Oh, it's coming.
these graphics just show the actual number of retirements, not the actual eligible.
Okay.
In the full experience study report, we do show that information.
Right.
But here we just reduce it to graphs.
Okay.
Yeah. Disability, again, you don't have very many disabilities. Yeah, these are very small rates of incidence that we assume, but we observed 3 actual disabilities over the 5-year period. I think our assumptions produced something like 20 expected. And so we're saying, let's really cut that rate down. You know, again, the experience is not too credible. I think for the prior 5-year period, there were 5 or 6 disabilities. This doesn't have a huge impact on the plan. It's a little counterintuitive when we get to the results, I'll show you. But again, we want to make sure we have some assumption for it, but pretty much any assumption we use is going to be kind of off. You're just going to, sometimes you're going to have several, sometimes you're going to have none, and we're trying to just assume over the long term that you have some, you know. But we do recommend a pretty big adjustment to this based on, and not just the last 5 years. In the full experience study report, it says, you know, the prior 5-year period, there were far fewer, but we didn't want to overreact. Now that we have 10 years of experience, we're going, yeah, these are too high. So we're adjusting downward. But just so you know, and it's again in the full report, these recommended rates would still produce, you know, more than the 3 that are shown here. I think they produce 11 maybe. Leaving room for some actual experience if you have more disabilities. These next assumptions we'll go through quickly. We have an assumption for when vested terminated employees terminate employment, they have a choice. Do I withdraw my employee contributions, in which case they are no longer entitled to a pension benefit from the plan, or do they leave their money in the plan, and when they reach retirement age, they can commence an annuity? And so we look at that. We're not recommending a change for that one. As you can see in the first row of the table, we assume 75% of those vested terminated members withdraw, and our experience to date is pretty close to that. So we're saying keep it at 75. For those who are eligible to retire, they can get a bump in their credited service for their unused sick leave and unused annual leave based on a review of the actual retirements. That works out to be a half a year on average, so we're recommending keeping that assumption the same. So for example, someone has 30 years of service, but they have enough annual leave that qualifies for half a year, 30.5 years will go into their benefit formula instead of 30. So that's what that's doing. Percent married and spouse age difference, that is used for a couple different reasons. The percent married, there's some death benefits that are based on whether you're married or not. So we assume 85% are married at retirement or death. And then the spouse age difference, again, we're paying the benefit for the spouse's lifetime, so we have to make an assumption there. I think the average age difference is between 2 and 3 years of those information. So those spouses we have information on.
So Mitchell, so then if a person elects to, if this age difference between the spouse and the employee is 2 years or more, then it costs them more to elect that spousal annuity. That's why we're using this, the age difference.
The age difference is, again, how long is the spouse can receive their benefit. So if they're younger, if it's a male participant, we assume a 2-year younger spouse, then it's paid, you know, they're younger, they're going to live longer. And vice versa, if it's a female employee with a male spouse.
That's an option that you select. It's not a given.
There's options for, it also goes into that joint survivor option as well for retirements, but it also, the death benefit, some death benefits are paid to the spouse, period. No election necessary. So that's where that's used, again, no change. And the form of annuity election, when someone retires, this is their choice. Do I want to take a life annuity? Do I want a joint survivor? Most people take the life annuity. When they elect a joint survivor, there is an actuarial reduction to account for the payment over 2 lifetimes. And so it's supposed to have the equivalent benefit value is the idea, but we still reflect that. And what we observed is, before we were assuming 75-25, we've observed it's closer to 80-20. Those are not big line items in the projection of the cost of the plan. Then we get into the economic assumptions. Inflation While it is not directly used for any assumption, it is a building block or underlying component of the salary increase assumption and the expected long-term rate of return on assets assumption. It's also used to project certain benefit limitations that are mandated by the IRS and are subject to annual cost of living increases tied to CPI. Based on the analysis, again, lots of detail in the report, we're not recommending a change of 2.5%. Again, we're looking at the long term. We're not focused on, hey, if we look at the last 5 years, inflation has been through the roof. We obviously have seen it taper down. But if you look at 30, 40, and 50-year periods, inflation is between 2.5 and 3.5, or excuse me, 2 and 3.5% generally. And those figures are, again, in the report. But we're recommending 2.5%, keeping that the same. For the COLA, it is also based on inflation. It is based on a specific measure, CPIW, the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners, as opposed to CPIU, which is urban consumption. And so it's a little different measure. But the big difference here is that the COLA for the plan is between 0 and 2%. So if inflation exceeds 2%, it's capped at 2. If inflation is flat or negative, it is limited to 0. And so when we look at inflation using CPIW over long periods of time, using those caps or the constraints of 0 to 2%, we get an average that, as again in the report, shows somewhere between 1.4 and 1.75%. So we're recommending that instead of using the 2% going forward, that we account for the fact that inflation is going to go up and down, and that means over the long term that it's not going to be 2% each year. So that's the idea there.
Budgeted or capped payout? This is the budgeted amount that we're putting in, or is this what we're capping it at?
It's capped by the terms of the plan documents.
So you're talking about reducing from 2% down to 1.65.
For an assumption. Now, in reality, each year we'll look at inflation for the year. If inflation for the year is more than 2%, the real COLA will be 2%.
Up to 2, okay.
But we're saying on average, as we project in the long term, 1.65.
So,
Yes, sir.
so thank you, Ms. Jonesy, for saying that. But I also would like us to look at it at a micro rather than just in a macro, because here in New Orleans, you're from New Orleans, right? Homeowner insurance is skyrocketing for our pensioners. It's more than just what's happening in macro in the country. It's also Southeast Louisiana, Gulf Coast, that our homeowners insurance, property taxes are being raised too. So we don't factor that in at all because you're looking at it just from the macro.
Well, that is correct. We don't factor it in, but that is because the plan document stipulates that this particular CPIW measure be used. So if the plan were amended to say, we want to use a different measure that's more local, then if the plan were amended, we would reevaluate that assumption. But because the plan says the COLA is based on CPIW, and it doesn't say it's based on a CPI measure specific to Louisiana or South, we don't take that into
So
account.
it could be a hybrid. And it's nothing for this particular study, but I'm just talking about going forward.
Look, if the pension committee wanted to do a design study on the COLA, and look at the measure used for the COLA, or look at the 2% cap or anything, we could do that, and then we could present you with some statistics on those differences between CPIW and whatever measure we might use. So that can be done, but that's kind of a separate project. And if something like that were adopted, then yeah, the next go around we'd be looking at that instead of CPIW.
So Chairman Pacho, I don't, when this study is done, horses out the barn, can I make a motion at this point or at another point that we?
Let's do that at another point.
Huh? Yeah.
Let's do that at another point.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to say, though, I appreciate you bringing that up because this is something that when we voted on the COLA this year, I expressed that I think it's one thing to say that over time, it sort of levels out, but like once the prices go up, they never really go down.
Correct.
So, and we're all, with the 2% cap, I think this year what we approved, because it's also then capped on
10,000, the first 10,000.
So people were really only getting a few $100s more a year, which
Maximum.
is nothing. And so it's almost silly to do it at all. when we're talking about such a small amount of money that we're increasing. And so I do think that I would like to have that discussion sooner than later, because it's come up again and again in this committee.
And if,
A couple of things, I also just want to make sure people appreciate that there's a multiple sides to this. Because we do have some, for example, you brought up of our property tax rates, and some of those may be going up. We talked about expensive goods. We also have some real issues in terms of life expectancy, overall valuation of wages here versus other places. That if we limit it, we may benefit in some areas, but overall lose in other areas. Because there are other areas that are in the sample size that drive up the average cost or average wage beyond what we actually do. So I'm not saying I'm for or against it. I just say that let's be mindful that there are things that can push us in a positive direction, but there are also some things that can push us in a not positive direction because our wages aren't like Atlanta's or our wages aren't like Houston. So the number we're starting with is much, much smaller.
Say a loaf of bread in Houston or in Atlanta costs us the same thing in New Orleans, but our wages are a lot lower. So we are feeling that more than anybody in the country. Anybody in the country. I just wanted to put that out there.
okay.
Are more localized metrics besides CPIW? Is there a more localized standard for this area that would be used in something like that?
I would need to research that. I'm not, but I'm suspect they're just like the CDC, publishes stats on mortality by state that I don't know for a fact, but the Bureau of Labor and Statistics may have something for CPI that gets into either regions or states, but I'm not familiar enough or conversant in that, but I can certainly do research if you all decide to start looking in that direction. And if that's the case, then yes, we could look at the $10,000 cap on the benefit to which COLA is applied. The COLA only applies to post-65 payments, not pre-65, and then the measure of the inflation as well as a 0 to 2%. So those could all be looked at together if you decide to go that direction.
Let's say it has come up before, and I was under the impression that this would be considered in this experience study. So I was wrong in my understanding of what we were going to be looking at in this study.
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, it's an additional standalone study at an
Okay.
additional cost.
Okay.
So we've gotten some preliminary information, so we could talk at a future
Yeah,
time
yeah.
about it, but it is separate.
Just to assure everyone that we'll take a look at it and see what factors are involved and then determine how we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Would that be appropriate, Gray?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So I don't want to spend, even though it's a very important assumption, and arguably maybe the most important assumption in evaluation, is the discount rate. We're not recommending a change, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But I do want to just kind of go over the methodology, which again, in the report, the full report, it gets into a lot more detail. But there's an investment policy statement that was amended in 2022, and it sets target allocations for each investment subaccount of the trust. And so you can see U.S. large cap, mid cap, et cetera, the target allocation. And the investment policy statement also indicates what benchmarks will be used to compare the investment manager performance to that of a certain benchmark. And so we take these target allocations, and also I'll point out that a small portion of the assets, about 4 or 5%, is held in Capital One and LAMP subaccounts. Capital One is used to pay the benefit payments as they come due. So that's where the cash position is. And LAMP, that's Louisiana Asset Management Pool, that's where the drop account money is put until a participant exits the drop. So we do factor that 5% of assets being in sort of cash or cash equivalents into our overall return, but the other 95% is based on this target allocation. And so we take that, and for each asset class, we establish a range of real returns. So we look at historical returns over as long a period as we have on these different benchmarks, and net out inflation. So we're looking at real returns for each asset class. Then we kind of look at low, medium, high, and select a real return assumption within the range. But it doesn't mean we're picking the midpoint every time. We're using our own sort of analysis to determine what we think the best assumption is within that range. Then we do a weighted return based on all those target allocations. So, 25% gets an expected real return of X, and 4% gets an expected real return of Y, and so on. We add inflation to that and back out the expected investment expenses of the plan. And we're looking at actual expenses paid from the plan, or 35 basis points as shown in that third row of the table. And so looking at the table, we have a low, medium, and high, as well as our selected assumption. And this is showing the aggregate weighted effect of all those assumptions. Again, the full report has all this information by asset category. But you can see that this produces, once you add inflation to the real return and back out investment expenses, these net assumptions somewhere between 5.84% and 8.31%. And our selected assumptions came closer to the midpoint. That is not intentional, it's just how they worked out, and right around 7%. And so we recommend keeping the 7% assumption. Again, lots of detail in the report, but no change here is the bottom line.
Thank you for explaining that, because I was wondering why you didn't use the midpoint. But
Yeah,
you just told me why.
Yes, and in fact, the actual standards of practice say don't use the mid, I mean, you can if that's your best assumption. And again, so we're not being too conservative or too aggressive in the aggregate.
Mitchell, one more point. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm new to
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
new to this,
Yes, sir.
so they know I ask a lot of questions anyway, right, Kassan? Now I'm new and I don't know, so I ask a lot of questions. But anyway, the money that we put in Capital One or in LAMP especially, those interest rates above what is paid, is any of that paid to the drop participant? And if it is that above that, does that go back into the plan as an investment?
So in LAMP, it is my understanding that 100% of the return in LAMP is paid to the drop participants.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
In the bank account, basically the Capital One, where the cash goes to pay the benefits, if there's any interest earned on that, that's to the benefit of the plan, because the plan is promising X dollars a month to each retiree, not any investment return.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Compensation increases, I'll try and speed through this so we can get to the next presentation, but here, this graph is showing the ratio of actual compensation to expected. So here, if the line or the bar is above 100%, so again, red is the current, blue is recommended. If it's above 100%, that means that the actual compensation increases were higher than we expected. If it's below 100%, that means the actual compensation increases were lower than what we expected. So you can see in the early ages, and this is what we see in general, that compensation increases as a percent of pay are much higher for younger people. Someone making $20,000 a year gets bumped to 22, that's a 10% increase. Someone making 60 that gets bumped to 62, not as big of a percent of increase. So, but it was still more than what we were expecting. In general, so as the observations show at the bottom, above or between age 25 and 29, we saw sort of the opposite of what we saw in the early ages. The assumption was too low. And so what we do is we're trying to get, with the blue, closer to 100%, but still recognizing that in some of these older age groups, we have a very small population, so we don't want to just say, oh, because 7 people got a below expected raise, we don't want to necessarily assume forever that that's the case. So again, there's sort of some credibility analysis going on at the later ages that's not necessary at the earlier ages. And so if we look at this, here's what this translates to. We're recommending a big increase for ages 20 to 24. Keep in mind, a lot of those people will terminate non-vested based on the other assumptions. So there's no true cost to the plan because they're just getting their money back. But if they do stick around, well, that's the base from which we're building forward. At ages 25 to 39, well, I guess 39, we're keeping it the same 35 to 39, but we're reducing a little. And then at the ages above 40, we're dropping the assumption a little bit. So that's the net effect of all this. And rather than get too hung up on, well, that I think we can skip to this slide to kind of talk about the effects of all these assumptions. And so you can see each row is dealing with, well, we start in bold with the liability and contributions based using the current assumptions. And the last one is, if you use all these new assumptions, what the net effect is. And each row is a given assumption change. And I think it's easier to start on the right side with the increase or decrease in the actual accrued liability and the effect on the funded ratio. So if we start with the mortality rates, we see that the mortality rates increase the liability $500,000 out of $363 million. So not a big change, which actually reduces the funded ratio, more liability, lower funded ratio of 0.1%. Retirement rates, like I said, we're assuming people are retiring at later ages, so the effect of paying out fewer years of benefits outweighs the cost of the additional accruals for working longer, reduces liability $3.7 million, and improves the funded status 0.7%. We could go through each one of these, but again, terminations, you have more terminations than expected under the new assumptions than previously assumed, reduces liability. Fewer people are working to retirement. Disability rates is the one that actually has one of the larger changes here, and it actually increases liability. The reason is, even though there's a pretty generous disability benefit, that doesn't kick in until you have at least 10 years of service. And so if you become disabled before 10 years of service, it's a smaller benefit. And so what ends up happening is, if you're not exiting the population due to disability, you're sticking around longer, and the other benefits that could get paid out, retirement, et cetera, are more valuable. So it increases the liability. Again, though, that's a 1% change in the funded ratio.
So 10 years, not 5, so it's not the same as vesting. So that's good.
Yeah,
So it's 10 years. So if I have reciprocity with the city of New Orleans, and I come here and I bring my pension over, if I've only been here 4 years, but I was with the city another 6 years, so I would be eligible for disability.
yes, yeah, and there still is a disability benefit. It's not nearly as valuable as if you've been here for 10 years.
Yeah.
And we do in the census information we collect for each individual, we know if they had service at NOMERS or another state plan, and so that is factored into our valuation.
Thank you.
And certainly the actual payment of benefits. And so on and so forth. And the compensation increase, because on average, even though it's higher, we're recommending a higher assumption at the early ages, the lower assumptions at the later ages outweigh that, and it reduces the liability a couple million. The form of payment assumption, that was really small, and I think I skipped the COLA. Instead of using 2%, using 1.65 reduces the liability a couple million. And so the net effect of all this is roughly a $7 million reduction in the liability from 363 to 358, and that improves the funded status by 0.9%. In the middle of this, if we translate that to, well, what happens to the employer contribution, the net effect of all this, it goes from 12.1 million to 11.2, a reduction of 900,000, which translates to 19.3% of earnable compensation instead of 20.8. Lastly, as this footnote states, right, this is based on the most recent valuation. These assumptions would first be used next year, and we expect them to have a very similar result on next year's numbers, but we'll update the census at that time. So that's the net effect.
Can I ask a question? What has been the trend on the funded ratio?
It's been going up. It's been going up. It went down a good bit before 5 years or 6 years ago. Before we did the experience study, we updated the mortality assumption because it was really outdated, and that dropped the funded ratio. I have to look back, but it may have been more than 5%. I mean, it was a big deal. In the last experience study, I think the net effect was an increase in liability, so it reduced funded status. But roughly, with the funding policy, it's improving roughly 1% a year. Again, now there's a lot that goes into that, asset returns, et cetera. But
A hard question. 80% is a good funding ratio in the country, in any plan, 80%. Sure. Right, 100% is
100% is perfect.
80% is good. 70% we're working towards.
Working towards, but on the right path, and not in 70% is not bad, you know. And in fact, in the experience study report, the last page shows some funded statuses of other plans in Louisiana, and there's some that are better, and I mean, it's just a sample. but some that are not as good. I think Nomer's is below this one.
How about the state?
But we're still in closed amortization with like 19 years left or somewhere around.
24,
25, okay.
25.
And what does that mean?
Well, that means that even though we may have gains and losses and that percentage may go up and down that funded ratio, because a year of poor asset returns, it may not go up, it may go down. It means that over that 25-year period, you're adjusting the employer contribution to make up for that. Whether it's, if you have better investment returns than expected, then the employer contribution will go down. If you have worse than expected, the employer contribution will go up. And so every year we adjust it so that we stay on track towards funding towards that 100%.
Towards 25 years.
Over roughly 25
So
years.
every year, 24, 23, 22?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, more or less. And another training, we can get the weeds on that one, but that's the idea.
And I will ask questions offline more about that.
Absolutely. That's
Quick
fine.
question, I hope
Yes.
it's quick. When we say percent of earnable compensation, is it safe to say, if we just take a glance at this, the employer is spending 20 cents on a dollar?
Yes,
For the contribution?
yes, exactly. Exactly.
And that percentage is based on the 2.5% that goes into effect on the first?
The
2.5% inflation.
The
No,
inflation.
increase in
Increase that-
employee salaries that goes into effect on the first?
So when we do the next valuation, that will be factored in, but it's factored in based on an assumption right now, you know? So it's in there. It's just, again, hey, that was different than what we assumed. There's a gain or loss.
So your data which you collected, the cutoff date was January 1st, 2024.
Yes.
Okay, so nothing in between.
No. So we're doing the 5-year analysis. We have to look back and,
Yes.
and the methods, I think we can skip. We're not making any recommended changes to the methods we use to value the liability, to the method that we use to smooth assets over 7 years so that we're, again, reducing contribution volatility, to the method of the level dollar layered amortization. That's that 25-year period in general we were just talking about. One change we recommend is, since we did the last experience study, the body that publishes a white paper on recommended funding policies has added something new, and it's how to address when a plan gets to 100% funded or more than 100%. How do you adjust your contributions to the plan? So we recommend putting something in. There's no rush to do that.
We far from.
We recommend we do it in the next 5 years simply so that it's in there. But it will, what happens is when you get to 100% funded, your contribution could be really volatile unless you put some smoothing in it. And
Unless you have an emerging market manager who can invest in NVIDIA.
yeah, right, exactly. So that is something that we will put on the to-do list, but there's no rush. And again, it's addressing a very good situation. So that is it. And just to summarize, recommend updating all those assumptions that we talked about. This reproduces the net effect of increasing or reducing the employer contribution by almost $1 million and reducing the percent of earnable compensation that's contributed. The surplus management we mentioned, and then just the process is, if the pension committee accepts the results of the experience study and recommends it to the Board of Trustees, next week the Board of Trustees would have a resolution to vote on, and if they vote on it to follow the study, then and our next valuations beginning in, well, 12/31/24 for financial reporting and in 25 for contributions, we would start using those assumptions. So that's the action item. And I know we're rubbing up against an hour here,
Yeah,
so
Yeah.
can we jump into the next one?
Let's go to the next presentation.
All right. So that's one action item completely independent of this. So
These were the considerations proposed by a member of the pension committee.
that's correct. So these were brought up, and so in general, the purpose of a plan amendment is you want to make sure that the plan design is consistent with the employer's workforce goals and recruitment and retention. And it's also another form of compensation besides actual cash wages, right? The Pension Committee and Board of Trustees has certain responsibilities that are outlined in the rules and regulations. The pension committees must act solely in the interest of plan members and beneficiaries. And GFOA guidance indicates that trustees should act in the interest of all plan members and not be motivated by personal views or interests.
Mitchell, when you put that in there, I thought it stood out like a sore thumb.
Okay.
And I need to know where is that reference, what book, that governance, GOFA governance. I tried to Google it and I couldn't find it.
Okay.
All right.
I can get that for you. And we did a trustee training, I don't know if it was in 24 or 23,
Last March.
It was
last
in
March, that has a bunch of links. And so I'll just start that, but if it's not there, I'll get that for you.
Thank you.
But in general, that's the fiduciary duty of the trustees anyway.
Right.
I mean, it's ethical.
Right, exactly. So, but again, these are just, rather than put, it's ethical, I'm just citing places where, it's outlined in both the rules and regulations and in other guidance. For the funding policy, the funding priorities is outlined in your funding policy. Besides saying how the plan is going to be funded with this closed amortization period, there's some general objectives and priorities to fully fund the plan, to pay all vested benefits when due, and to have as stable a contribution as you can have within reason. The policy also talks about benefit enhancements, which would occur potentially through a plan amendment, and it just outlines the process that the actuary would need to give a report on the effect of the amendment on the pension plan's funded ratio and the annually determined contributions, so that the members would have all the information they need financially to make a decision. On the financing side, when you amend the plan, you need to either have a separate source of funding available to pay for the enhancements or be sure that the increase in cost is within the budget. And then in a plan like this, it's contributory. Would employees share the cost of the enhanced benefits? They currently contribute 6%. Would a higher contribution be considered? And lastly, legal considerations, which we'll talk a little bit about in general. So the three changes that we were asked to look at were a change in the vesting schedule from 5 to 10 years. So it's shown in this vesting graphic. That would mean that anybody between 5 and 10 years would be the affected population. I've been here 10 years, no effect, I'm already 100% vested. If I'm less than 5, no effect, I'm not vested. But between 5 and 10 years, now folks would not be vested. The benefit formula in change number 2, the current factor works this way. For the first 25 years of service, it's 2.5% per year of service and 4% thereafter, up until you reach 100%, which happens at about 34 years and 3 months or something like that. The proposed factor would change that first factor for the first 25 years from 2.5% to 3%. So that's what we were asked to look at. The third change was there is a maximum benefit that can be paid from the plan. The IRS stipulates a limit. It's $280,000 a year, or the average of the last 3 years of compensation. It's really the $280,000 that matters here. And the change was recommended to look at what if you reduce that from the current level to $130,000. And as I'll mention, not a lot of people would be affected by that handful, and more in the future than right now as inflation increases benefits. But those are the three changes we were asked to look at.
So the highest 3 years, that's what the IRS, that's not what.
That's not, yeah, because the plan uses a 5-year average.
Gotcha.
Exactly. We did some rough estimates a couple years ago, and the first and third changes, which again are the vesting and the maximum benefit reduction, those would decrease the plan cost, and obviously increasing the accrual would increase the cost, and that's the one that's material. The other actually don't have too big of an effect on the cost, but they may affect individuals in a big way, right? So it's not always just cost, it's the thing you need to look at. Collectively, the amendments would increase the liability $15 million. And again, that's based on that 360 roughly liability. And it would increase the employer's annual contribution $2.5 million a year. The figures we're showing here before and after are based on current assumptions. Obviously, you have not adopted the recommended assumptions yet. So that's why I'm using the 12.1 million as the baseline instead of the 11.2. But it would translate to roughly the same post-assumption changes.
Could you give me the breakdown of changes from numbers 1 and 3
Uh,
for them?
I can, I may have to do that after the meeting. It's in a letter. Gray, do you happen to have that letter from 2022 or 23?
I can look at that.
Okay, we do have that.
Okay, I'll get it from Gray. That's
Okay,
okay. I won't
yes.
hold you up.
But I believe that those are a few $100,000 reduction,
Okay.
and then this other one's
So they're not, they're
the millions.
immaterial.
Yeah. And so it would increase the contribution 2.5 million, which is a significant from the current level of 20.8 to 25.2, big increase, and decrease the funded status by 3%. So that would be the effect of this. Now,
That's in the reduction from the 3%, from two, increase from
Increase from
2.5 to 3%.
Yeah.
That's where all the cost.
that's where all that cost is coming
Can
from.
you explain that to me? I don't understand what that would do.
What, the accrual factor?
Number 2, yeah.
So what it would do is for someone who works here for 30+ years, they're still going to get to 100%, right? So their ultimate cost is not affected, although they get there sooner, so they might go out sooner. They get there about 3 years sooner.
Okay.
But for the average employee who doesn't work the full career here, works 15 or 20 years, it's a 25% increase in their benefit.
I see.
So that's where a lot of that cost is coming from.
And that is at par with the civilian NOPD employees.
Well, what is it with the SID numbers?
NOMERS has the same formula as this.
Yeah, no, that's our fault.
Ours.
Yes.
Yeah.
With one exception, they actually reduced the benefits for people hired after 2018.
Right.
People hired before 2018 have the same benefit.
Yeah, okay.
And just to give you, the post-2018 hires just get the 2.5% for all years of service. So they have a.
I think that changed. I think we need to look at that, Mitchell. I think that they did that on the Stacy Head proposal, and they changed it back. So we need to verify that.
Yeah, well, and my understanding is at one point they went down to 1.9%.
Yeah, because
Brought it back to 2.5.
And they brought it back to 2.5, but not for all years of service. I mean, sorry, for all years of service as opposed to the 2.5 and the 4.
it's 2.5 for the first 25, 4% afterwards.
Okay, well,
Yeah, they get the 4.
we can confirm.
Yeah,
that.
we need to
Yeah,
confirm that. So I don't want to hold you up on that.
okay, but more or less, this plan has the same design as NOMERS. So one thing is these cost amendments, cost estimates assume these could be implemented retroactively. And talking with Yolanda Grinstead, understand that the vesting and maximum benefits could not be implemented retroactively, only prospectively, so it would just be for new hires. And then for the benefit enhancements, I think they probably could be implemented retroactively, but I have not received confirmation of that. But that's what those cost estimates did.
Wait, so not retroactively means your work agreement when you started
Is what you have.
is what you have. It wouldn't be changed. You'd have 2 separate.
You'd have 2 separate classes of employees, at least with respect to vesting and benefit limits.
Correct.
The accrual could maybe be done for everyone. Need confirmation of that. So in considering these amendments, you have to think about what would these amendments accomplish for retention and recruiting. If someone now has to be here 10 years to vest, it might hurt recruitment. Obviously, if they're getting a 3% accrual, it might help. Which members gain benefit value? Well, the ones that work a full career here don't gain any benefit value from the increased accrual. They may be able to exit sooner. But certainly those midterm service folks would benefit. And then in terms of looking forward, the longer vesting is going to mean fewer people would become vested and get the benefits. Does that hurt the retention and recruiting efforts? And then with respect to the benefit cap, who's being affected by that? It's not necessarily those in executive leadership. It could be the career employee who ends up making an engineer who makes $140,000 a year. They would be affected by that.
And not the top tier.
It would only be the top tier if they're here a full or a lengthy career.
So that mid-range is really the group impacted.
I think
Yeah, and sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, there's really a big, and these things that are being proposed, I'm kind of surprised that, because this is really about compensation. And that's a sewage and water board issue. And the question is, if there's a change that needs to be made to this plan because of solvency or meeting costs, et cetera, it's up for the board to decide what that is.
Correct.
And then send it to the pension committee for analysis, the board of trustees for analysis for how it affects the solvency and the health of the plan. So there's a step that's kind of missing in this whole process.
Okay. And so that may be something to consider with respect to that discussion about the COLA, and maybe that should come from in that direction. But just to speed through here, you know, these are, again, we mentioned here that the benefits are nearly identical to NOMERS. There's a reciprocity agreement between here and NOMERS about transfers. If the benefit formulas were different between the two, then that reciprocity agreement would need to be updated. And you know, again, as we just kind of talked about, is comparing Swiveno's benefits to MPERS a correct analogy or not? And so I think we've covered these other points, and except for the last one, that these amendments would not benefit current retirees. None of these enhancements apply to current retirees, and they would end up being less well-funded in their benefits. So in considering some of those things I mentioned earlier about what the rules and regulations say, you want to look at amendments from the global perspective of all members, not just current employees, and who benefits and who maybe have a less well-funded benefit as a result.
I just want to make a point I was trying to make. When we were talking about who would it affect for the 10-year vesting, and it wouldn't cost, the plan would gain if a person left here in 8 years because he could only leave with his contribution and not the board's contribution.
Correct.
So that 20%, 25%, whatever the board is putting in for him will stay in the plan, and that would benefit the plan. I just wanted to bring it up.
Yes.
I think you said one side,
That's-
but there's
no,
another side
so
that would benefit the plan.
that's why-
And I needed to say that.
Yes, sir. And that's why I said that costs, or amendments 1 and 3 would reduce the plan costs, because longer vesting means exactly that. Also, a lower maximum benefit would mean payout of smaller benefits. Again, those contributions, excess contributions would go to the benefit of the remaining members.
75% drop even after vesting, and that's the assumption that's been proven correct. So it
Yes.
really shouldn't have that much of a material
Yeah,
impact
well, which is
anyway.
part of why this vesting change doesn't have a material effect on the projected cost. But that's an excellent point.
No, I don't really get the point. I don't get the point that she was making.
So one of our assumptions is that if people terminate vested, 75% of them withdraw their contributions
Yeah,
in lieu of
Right.
getting the benefit of the employer's contributions to the plan.
Right.
And so if we increase the vesting period from 5 to 10, yes, fewer people will be eligible to make that choice. You know,
Right.
They just have to go return their contributions, but we're already assuming 75% would make that choice. So it's really.
Once they get it, that's once they get in drop. That's long past the
not the
vesting.
drop.
I thought she mentioned drop.
So it's
That's what I
once you're
said.
vested.
No, she was talking about the withdrawal
okay.
assumption, not the drop
So
assumption.
year
I see.
5 to year,
Yeah.
whenever you're gonna
Top it out
retire,
versus-
75% pull their funds out, and they're not waiting for.
Yes,
Correct.
yes, and
Before they make
Which
it
is
to the
high.
10 years.
Which is high. Drop, she meant dropping out. I
Yes.
didn't
Oh,
get it.
yeah,
That's
right.
what I
They
didn't
withdraw their
I'm sorry.
funds.
I'm
They
sorry.
withdraw their own funds.
Got it.
on pension terminology.
So what I understand is that if somebody opt out before 10 years, their plan would gain by not contributing the 20% matching. And if they will just take whatever they accrued at that point.
That's right, they're just taking the cumulative 6% employee contributions they've paid, and anything the employer put on their behalf now goes to the benefit of everyone else in the plan.
Is there interest or anything, or they just?
They get
so well?
interest, they get interest.
Right, but not the 20%, the
Yeah,
20% on the
and-
dollar,
and-
not the 20% on the dollar that the
They get-
board puts in
No.
for them.
Yes, right.
Just to abreast, may I speak for a few minutes, Mr. Chairman?
Let him finish and then.
Let me do this last slide and then, thank you. Again, like I said at the beginning, we put this on hold to see our baseline based on the experience study. as I talked about during the other slides, the net effect of those assumptions does not materially affect the employer's contribution to the plan. It reduces it, but it does not change. It's not drastic. It's not a 20% change or something like that. So our prior cost estimates that are outlined here remain relevant. We did not update those. Our recommendation would be, as the actuary, as a plan actuary, that do not adopt any of these amendments retroactively. Legally, you can't, but as I mentioned there, but also don't believe reducing the funded status below 70% is desirable. Again, we're on the right track. 70% is not a bad funded status, but want to be heading towards 100.
And we're moving in the right direction.
Yes, we are.
All right.
While these amendments could be adopted prospectively, again, we would advise against it. Again, this is considering all three in aggregate, not one at a time or anything like that. That the vesting and maximum benefit reductions conflict with the employer's workforce goals. The amendments, just looking prospectively, would increase the employer contribution by 1.75% of earnable compensation, or $1 million per year. But they, again, like we said, they don't change the ultimate benefit for full career employees, shown in that green sub-bullet, that you still get to 100%. Now you do it in 31.25 years under the enhanced formula, as opposed to 34.4 years under the current. But it doesn't change that ultimate benefit. And what we would say is, if you have an extra $1 million to put in the plan each year, put it in the plan and don't amend the plan, and accelerate the improvement of the funded status. Right. And then, just in general, we would recommend that you don't improve the benefits in the plan materially unless the plan is at least 80% funded, preferably 90, but I mean 80% is a good place to be. Or if you could write a check for the increase in the cost today, fine, that doesn't affect the ongoing cost. So that would be another way, even if the plan was not 80% funded. Or if the change in the annual contribution due to the amendment could be funded either without jeopardizing the ability to fund the ADC as it existed prior to the amendment, like, oh, we could easily put in 25%. Okay, well, that would be something. Or you have a separate source of funding outside that can be designated just for this. So on balance, based on everything we as actuary know about the plan, we would recommend not adopting these amendments either retroactively or prospectively, but we serve at the pleasure of the board.
Let me ask you one question. As far as the employees' contribution, if we increase it, because previously it used to be 4% for a very long time, and
Yes.
then we matched it with the city to 6%. If we temporarily increase it to 7% to make the deficit, how long it'll take for us to keep at the 70% threshold?
So these cost estimates, the funding policy says that a plan amendment should be funded over a 15-year amortization period. So the increased costs are for that 15-year period specifically. So if you were to increase the employee's cost, by 1.75% per year for 15 years, that would be a way to pay for the cost of the amendment over that period of time.
But one thing which I don't know if you calculated or not, the benefit of one in proposal number 3, what it would, let's forget about number 2, what enhancement you see in the overall picture?
So for number 1, it would produce some savings, as we mentioned, for the plan to have a longer vesting period. It would harm, potentially, recruitment, because people might look at that and go, well, I'd rather work for the city and get vested in 5 years and get the same benefit than work for here, things like that. Retention-wise, maybe it helps with retention for people who are at 7 or 8 years of employment, go, well, I'm going to stick around until I'm vested. But for people at 5 or 6 years, they might go, well, I don't want to stick it out. So again, those are, I don't know how that would work. Cost-wise, it's not a huge reduction, again, because what we talked about, we have most people withdraw anyway. In this case, we're looking at the 5 to 10 year vested people withdrawing. compared to assuming they no longer have that option and must withdraw. So not producing a lot of savings to the plan there. And on the reducing the maximum benefit, like I said, it doesn't produce a lot of savings, and I can, as Ms. Howard asked, I can go back and kind of split that out. But it doesn't produce a lot of savings because there's only a handful of people who are expected to work here long enough to get the full benefit and who have high enough pay.
Minuscule percentage on that threshold.
We've already provided this information separately earlier, so.
I would like to get it. I wasn't here.
But you're not talking about when this was proposed, and when you spoke with a lot of employees and had them sign papers, you intimated that it was going to ensure that the leadership team wasn't coming in for a few years and getting this huge benefit that our employees aren't getting. But the reality is who this would affect would be the people that have a full 30 to 34-year career here. These are not the people that are coming in at the top salaries. These are the long-term, mid-level employees that this would affect. That's why there's already one set by the federal government. It's already there. The protection's already in place. It's already done. There's no reason for us to reduce it. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help recruitment and retention. There's no benefit.
But,
What option are you talking about?
but keep in mind for over 100 years, our investment period was, as far as my personal research, till 2000, it used to be 10 years. Because of the political mingling, it was reduced. So, and the employees, and as far as the 3% contribution, we are essential employees. No city can run without our services. So we are at par, just like the NOPD civilian employees, non-uniform, because the uniform get almost 3.6 or 3.7% per annum entitlement for the pension, but the NOPD non-uniform employees get 3%, and our neighboring Jefferson Parish get 3%, Shreveport get 3%, Alexandria get 3%, Baton Rouge get 3% from the employees. So keeping it par, this is an incentive which was voted in by over 600 employees. It's the will of the employees, and we can, Mr. Chairman, we can have, just like we have the election, we can conduct the, referendum by the employees, so we can have a clear picture. And as far as the deficit, we can talk and put it to the employees that if they want to contribute temporarily a higher percentage to make up the benefit, where they can walk away from 100% at 31.25 years instead of waiting for 34 years.
Janet?
The compensation structure is a matter for the Board of Directors of the Sewage and Water Board. Any change affecting things such as increasing the rate of, what do you call it? Accrual has to go through the Board of Directors. They're the ones that set the policies on compensation. And right now, it's being done indirectly through the Pension Committee. And the Pension Committee would actually have to pass on any change made by the Board of Directors.
That's correct.
But this is not, this is not the place where this kind of decision should be made.
And what we currently have, we've requested an analysis by Rudd and Williams, and they have done the analysis relative to the plan considerations that were proposed. We have a recommendation, so we're at a point where we need to address recommendations of Rudd and Williams in respect to the experience study and also to the plan amendment consideration. So that's really where we are. And I appreciate,
I'm not on the committee.
I appreciate the extra input, but that's really where we are right now.
So, Mr. Chairman, are you ready for a motion?
I certainly am. Dexter?
Yeah.
Dexter?
No, after the motion, then I can, if someone seconds it, then I can have a question.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, Chairman.
I'm sorry, I'm not done. Can these be taken in global, or they have to be taken individually?
Let's take the recommendation first of the experience study
Okay.
and then do the second.
Okay, thank you. I yield.
So I'll entertain a motion for acceptance of the recommendations.
So I move that we accept the recommendation R176, 2024, to accept the actuarial experience study of the employees' retirement system.
Second?
Second?
You have a second. Any discussion? Any public comment?
There are none.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Now let's move to the second resolution.
I move that we accept the recommendation or reject all three of the proposed amendments as recommended by the actuarial R177, 2024.
Second? I have a motion and a second. Any discussion?
Discussion.
Question?
I would like to say that by putting these three together, didn't give us the proper opportunity to discuss each one of them and give the weight that it should have been given. So I disapprove of the way it was done. Just Johnny come lately who I am. So we didn't give enough attention to each one of them. And during the conversation, it was convoluted. But sometimes I heard Ms. Johnson say something, and it must have been towards Amendment 3. And then I heard Mr. Mobley say something, and it was regarding something else. So I was confused because we didn't give it the proper weight for each one of them individually. I would like to say that. And also, I would like to say the spirit of some of the things, because I heard some things like a petition was signed, and again, like I pointed out to Mr. Mitchell, was something, a bullet in there saying that each individual trustee should be looking out for the entire plan. So I would like to say, I think the spirit of what this was, the amendments that were suggested was in the spirit of the plan, not for individual. Then I campaigned for my job to be on the board, and I spoke with a lot of employees, and some of these issues were something that they are concerned with. So I think we need, I don't think we need to go back to this, but, and this is on the table now, but I just think that it is valid, maybe the way it's been presented. It's not the correct way, but I think some of these issues are valid.
Duly noted. Any additional public comment?
Yes, sir. I would like to make a comment that Board of Trustee, we have great respect for them. Board members, we have great respect for them. But you got to take into account the people who have the skin in the game. We cannot impose our wills from outside to the will of employees. We cannot override. And that is why I highly recommend before you make any motion to accept or reject, so please consider seriously going back to the people who are the contributor and who are the owner of this pension plan, get their will incorporated so they can understand and they can make a better educated decision rather than just outright rejecting. And Mr. Chairman, you know as well as anybody that this was signed by overwhelming majority of the more than 50% of the employees in 2 days.
2 points on that. One, I think we have, and two, I'm not aware, and I don't know if anyone is aware, of how this was presented to the employees in terms of that initial petition. I'm not going to go there, but that's a concern I have, and I'll just make that comment. Any other comments?
There is no harm.
Any other comments?
I would just like to say, I think that obviously we have a difficult job here and that we have to balance the needs of the employer and the retirees. Obviously, the pension plan is a benefit that the employer offers to our employees. And so I think that the benefit plan that we have now in terms of a pension is extremely generous compared to most private sector jobs that are available and even many public sector jobs in other places. And I think to increase the burden of funding for our employees to give them 3.5 years faster retirement, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think our job as we will sit next week as the Board of Trustees is to, steward this plan for the long term. And that's ultimately should be our number.
And I think part of my comment would be supportive of that analysis.
Yeah.
I want to make that for the record. Okay, We have a motion, it's been second. We have a discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Duly note one in opposition. Motion carries. Thank you. Mitchell?
I discussed earlier making a motion that we get a separate study on doing a more micro look at doing a CPI for the retirees, and I don't know how to make that motion, but that did, you said we'll do it later, and I don't want us to adjourn the meeting without talking about that.
Since that's an additional item to be added to the agenda, an additional action item, initially there would have to be a vote by this board, a unanimous vote, to change the agenda, to add that action item.
Can I try this a different way? Can I just request to the chair, if it pleases the chair, that at the next pension committee meeting in January, we add an item to the agenda to discuss cost of living amendments to the plan? And we'd like to hear a report on progress towards studying that.
I'll second that if that was a motion.
It's not a motion.
Not
it's
a
just
motion.
It's just a request.
That's just a request.
You can't
Just
change
a
the agenda
request.
once it's already public.
So Dexter, you and I can talk about as much as we want in January, we just can't do it today.
All right.
Yes.
We will make sure that happens, okay? Any information items? All right, any other public comments?
There are none?
If there are no other matters, then I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Aye.
Second.
Aye.
Favor? Aye. Motion carries. We are now adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, Mitchell.
Thank you.